This episode of Cartoon Conspiracy is sponsored by Nickelodeon.
While Halloween might have been a little while ago, us here at Cartoon Conspiracy are doing what we can to keep that flame burning for at least another week. Look, if anything, I'm doing you a favor. Everybody knows that the marketing cycle just skips over Thanksgiving. I can practically hear the jingle bells of the holidays trying to knock my door down. Besides, how can we not keep the Halloween atmosphere going when this week we're talking about one of the quintessential monsters that we somehow never really talked about in our Castlevania episode a couple weeks ago? Yes, this week we are actually talking about vampires. As it turns out, there are more than a few vampires hiding in Welcome to the Wayne. Yeah, in the adventures of Ansi, Ollie, and Saraline through the impossibly huge complex of the Wayne, one character we've interacted with quite a bit is the mysterious Andrei. And of course he's mysterious, he's had amnesia, so of course we wouldn't know a whole lot about his life before living in the Wayne. Though since the season finale, we've come to learn a great deal about him. Spoiler alert, by the way. The most important thing this gave us is that Andrei is the leader of the vampires of Glamsterdam. And him being a vampire, it makes sense. He looks the part, he seems to have all the natural staples of being one, and virtually every character in the show calls him as such, especially the spy. But while I was watching the show, I couldn't help but notice little things that made me think twice about his true identity. I'm Jacob with ChannelFrederator, and today we're going to be exploring the twisty-turny corridors of the Wayne to answer the question, are Andrei and his people really vampires? Let's see if we can trace the origins of his traits. To be clear, if Andrei is never revealed to be anything other than a vampire, I'm not here to tell Welcome to the Wayne that it's wrong about anything. I'm not the vampire police. Everybody knows the vampire police is located in Transylvania and they're not returning my calls. So as I said before, the show makes it clear that Andrei and his people are unquestionably vampires. But there are certain qualities that I find curious, which has led me down this whole rabbit hole where I start to second guess their vampireness as a whole, because this is how I've been trained to think over the last 2 years. But yeah, so let's start by first defining what classical aspects of vampirism Andrei possesses. His skin color is abnormal, which is pretty par for the course, although different depictions of vampires run the entire gamut of the color spectrum. In fact, Andrei's green is one of the less represented colors. But while more classical depictions tend to describe vampires as being pale rather than a different color, other writers like Stephen King tend to stray a little farther in the color spectrum, so this all checks out. And being a more modern vampire, Andrei has a sense of style reminiscent of various counterculture scenes, borrowing from punk and gothish looks befitting of a social outcast like a vampire. Other hints of being a vampire that Andrei has would be the lack of a reflection, pointed ears, levitation, uncanny strength and athleticism, burning in sunlight, all that good stuff. But there are other aspects to Andrei that are a little more uncommon in classic vampire depictions. For example, Andrei glows in the dark and has a natural predator in the moonfish, shown in the episode Spacefish. There's also the substantial detail that Andrei doesn't drink blood, nor do any of his people as far as we're aware. Granted, this is a Nickelodeon show, and drinking blood isn't exactly what a lot of people would call fun for the whole family. I mean, I would. But just because it might not be right for the show doesn't mean it's not worth mentioning. Blood-sucking is, after all, one of the core traits that defines a vampire in most literature. Andrei also appears to lack the ability to shapeshift, which is another pretty well-known trait in vampires. At the very least, a lot of them are able to turn into bats or something. Not to mention the rainbow gas present in Welcome to the Wayne as well. It's unknown what the exact properties of this mysterious substance are, since it seems to have a different effect on everyone, but we've seen its effect on Andrei in detail. And it seemed to enhance all of his previous abilities, along with giving the power to go full Super Saiyan and just wreck anything standing in the way. The rainbow gas is also something the spy is very interested in during the first season, and particularly how it applies to Andrei, and it's not hard to see why. After all, the spy's goal is to take over the Wayne, and in her mind, once her plan to recruit the vampires that live in the lost city of Glamsterdam come to fruition, she can then weaponize the rainbow gas, use it on the vampires and their lost leader, take over the Wayne and all of the creatures in it, and then move on to world domination or whatever it is her organization is really after. Really, the Spy and Masterson are just kinda like Team Rocket if Jesse and James knew what they were doing and were actually kinda good at their job for the most part. Also, the Spy is voiced by Veronica Taylor, who also played Ash Ketchum in Pokemon, which, I don't know, I just thought that was a fun connection. Ash is a member of Team Rocket, Cartoon Conspiracy confirmed. Finally, since we're talking about the vampires of Glamsterdam, they all seem to be connected by a sort of beacon at the center of the city, which has the power to control them to a degree. But it's that same beacon that Team Timbers, I mean the Gyre, or Team gyre timbers is able to disrupt, freeing all of the vampires in the process. This almost makes it seem like the vampires are a sort of hive mind, with that beacon being the center of operations. So as far as Andrei's roots as a vampire go, we're all over the place. There's definitely some classical inspiration there, but there are also so many uncommon traits that I can't help but wonder. Can we find precedent in the expansive past of vampire fiction and folklore for all of Andrei's characteristics? The general standard of vampires in the public consciousness would arguably come from Bram Stoker's Dracula. While there were other works before, like The Vampire and Carmilla, Stoker's Dracula is usually what people think of when you say vampire, though there are similarities between all of these works. Stoker's take on Dracula is pretty much what we're all familiar with a couple of exceptions. For example, while he does have fangs and feeds on blood and all that good stuff, sunlight doesn't kill him, it only weakens him, except at midday when he becomes stronger. This is the same Dracula that people argue was based on the real-life historical figure Vlad the Impaler, who earned the name Dracula during his tyrannical rule. You know, not that I'd expect any other kind of rule when the word Impaler is in your name. Though speaking of his name, originally Dracula meant son of the dragon, referring to his father Vlad Dracul. But in modern Romanian, Dracula also means devil, so this is a pretty stacked name, which would explain why so many adaptations of Dracula run with this inspiration. However, in recent years, through Dracula's many depictions, many have suggested that one version of Dracula that wasn't inspired by Vlad was Bram Stoker's Dracula. Apparently throughout the work, Stoker shows very little knowledge of the man's life, only borrowing aspects of the setting and other info to create his own vampire mythology. Certainly not enough to claim that the character was inspired by Vlad the Impaler. It's been discovered in Stoker's original notes for when he was writing the book, there are a whopping 0 references to the monstrous Vlad. All this to say, already in the monster's earliest years, we can see how varied the depictions of the blood-sucking beasts of Romania actually are. And it only spread out from there, like the roots of a tree branching off into a million different directions. So let's talk about Andrei. Or more specifically, let's talk about the vampire's home, Glamsterdam. Given the size and splendor of the city, combined with the old-fashioned Gothic motif of vampires, it's undoubtedly a reference to the old name for New York City, which was New Amsterdam, and this fits pretty well, since many people did believe in vampires in 18th and 19th century America. Though many of these reports were mostly contained in the New England area, which doesn't include New York, but it's pretty darn close. But it's also worth exploring the origin of New Amsterdam for its European roots. Amsterdam, of course, being the capital city of the Netherlands. But when looking at the Netherlands as a whole, vampires seem to make up a pretty noticeable gap in their traditional literature and folklore. The closest relation readily available is that Abraham Van Helsing, the aging doctor turned vampire hunter from Bram Stoker's novel, is of Dutch origin. Side note, how did depictions of Van Helsing go from this?
I prefer to remain and protect those whom you would destroy.
To this? But that's such a tiny connection that it's hard to believe that it's intentional. It's entirely possible that Glamsterdam is not a reference to vampires and is just a reference to, again, the size and splendor of the city, comparing it to New York. Okay, so next let's talk about predators. In Welcome to the Wane, it's shown that the moonfish is a natural predator of the vampire. This isn't really the case in traditional folklore, but to broaden the question a bit, do vampires even have natural predators at all? Outside of humans, I mean? The most common ones whenever they pop up, interestingly, is werewolves. From when Dracula kept a werewolf as a slave in Return of the Vampire, to Tolkien's The Lay of the Lethean, wherein vampires and werewolves have an adversarial relationship, to the werewolves, not swearwolves, and What We Do in the Shadows, to Twilight. But look, while vampires don't really have any connection with ethereal astral moonfish anywhere except in the Wane, if a werewolf were to show up in season 2, that might curb some doubts as to whether Andrei is actually a vampire. Though you might want to keep the two in separate rooms. After all, we don't know what Andrei's relationship with a werewolf would be within the context of the show, so better safe than sorry, right? Okay, so what about this beacon hive mind idea? The idea of all vampires being linked isn't super uncommon. You know, you've got the virality zombie thing where people can turn into vampires via vampire bites. But even as far back as Bram Stoker's Dracula, vampires have been depicted as telepaths. Some versions have shown all vampires to be linked by one ruler, sometimes referred to as a king or queen. An example of this would be in the 80s cult classic Lost Boys, wherein those affected with vampirism are cured of it after the head vampire is killed. And while that isn't quite the same thing as a beacon at the center of the vampire's home city, this kind of spiritual telepathic link isn't a far cry from that. Okay, moving along, one thing I didn't mention before is that Andrei is scared of spoons. Insert people tossing spoons from a screening of The Room here. And I know what you're thinking, well, that makes sense. Spoons could be made of silver. Silverware. And if they're made of silver, silver hurts vampires. Sound logic, that was my first thought too. Much like werewolves, silver is a well-documented weakness of vampires. But nope! Andrei isn't afraid of silver, just spoons. Besides, if the vampires were afraid of silver, then logically speaking, they should also be afraid of all other cutlery that could be made of silver, right? What about the rainbow gas? Well, its effect of enhancing the abilities of vampires can mean a few different things. While there's little precedent of a gas or smoke that enhances vampires' abilities, there is a monster in Dungeons & Dragons formed from the mist of dead vampires called vampiric mist. And this mist still possesses basically the same properties as vampires themselves. That could be what's going on here. When the rainbow gas comes into contact with non-vampires, it transforms them into various monstrous beings, but when it comes into contact with a vampire, like Andrei, as it did in Spacefish, it enhances the vampire's abilities by siphoning its own power into the vampire itself. Alternatively, the rainbow gas could be read as a replacement for blood, as it serves a similar purpose. It replenishes the energy of vampires, but also causes them to gain strength. And if you're Andrei, have amnesia, and don't know your own strength, then it would be pretty surprising to discover your true potential through this gas. Or maybe since the gas has the ability to shift the shape of beings, it could be the essence of the shape-shifting powers of vampires distilled into one gas. Or the rainbow gas could be a combination of all of these things. We might need to revisit the nature of rainbow gas in a future cartoon conspiracy, because while it's a super important element of the show, its properties are still so vague and mysterious to us. But with a show like Welcome to the Wayne, would you expect anything less? There are encrypted messages all over the Wayne too, we haven't even touched those. And lastly, while several versions of vampires are known to have glowing eyes, to have the whole person glow in the dark is significantly rarer. In fact, the closest comparison I could find wasn't from vampires that glow in the dark, they more, I don't know, sparkle. And it's not in the dark so much as it is in the sunlight. Look, I'm sorry, okay? Twilight is the closest example of this from anywhere else that I could find. There might be some out there, but this is the most well-known equivalent as far as I can tell. But again, since Andrei prefers to hang out at night and isn't a huge fan of the sun, it's clear that his character isn't borrowing much from the Stephanie Meyer series. But even if he was, would it matter? As we've seen throughout this video, while Andrei and his people may be missing certain key components of what makes a traditional vampire, there's been so much variance in them over the years that it would be ridiculous to discount their validity just because they lack these characteristics. And while we may not be able to find a direct example of some of his traits, we can at least trace those back to something that would inspire that trait to begin with. I mean, vampires like Andrei already have a whole page on TV Tropes dedicated to them called Our Vampires Are Different. This kind of thinking is highlighted in the episode Today Was Wasome, in which Wendell and Ansi hunt what they think is a vampire, which makes sense since it possesses a lot of the traits we normally associate with them, only to cleverly misdirect us and have it turn out to be something completely different. So with all this in mind, as far as the question of Andrei being a vampire goes, on the plausibility meter, I'm gonna have to rate it 5 postcards out of 5. Even though there are 8 in the show. But what do you think? Do you think there's worth in sticking to the traditional roots of vampires, or do you think it's better to reinvent them and make their own version whenever they pop up? And after the events of the season finale, what do you think the future holds for the Wayne? Let us know in the comments. Once again, I'm Jacob, and never forget, Frederator loves you.